Without further ado, Dr. Danica Hayes.
Good morning, everyone. You can hear me in the back, I hope. Good morning. Come on, you all have to wake up a little bit. All right, good morning. First, thank you very much for having me. I see a lot of familiar faces, and I feel really welcome all the way from Vegas. I want to thank Steve Flynn for inviting me to speak to you today, and I just want to congratulate you so far on a great conference. It's a wonderful conference so far. So, as Steve alluded to, this conference is all about innovation, and what I want to talk to you today is about how, as counselor educators and future counselor educators, we can create innovative cultures for our peers and for our students. And so today I'm going to talk about 6 climate issues that I have become familiar with as a tenure track faculty member, as a program coordinator, as a department chair, and now in the position of the Executive Associate Dean at UNLV. And I invite you to this space to think about these issues, and at the end of the presentation, I'll share with you 75 strategies for addressing them. Just trust me, I won't go through all of them, but you'll have them. So, a few notes before we begin. We don't usually think about faculty climate until things are really bad, right? We see something that we might consider bad weather in our programs and go, oh, that's just kind of a bad thing that happens. But faculty climate is really about the pervasive issues that seem to continue in our programs. And I think as counselor educators, we need to be able to really think about these and reflect on them. And so even if you think your counselor education program is healthy, and I applaud you, I have not met anyone that has said they have the perfect faculty, but even if it is, I ask you to consider how some of these issues might be present in your programs or how you might assess for their presence. And so you could join me in this space and just think about these. A lot of times we see diversity among our faculty, or we see a lot of women, and we think that we have representation. We think we're counselors, so we have great micro skills, and that every decision-making process is very well executed, and all those things. And it just doesn't happen. So I've worked at 3 institutions now, and I've always been a part of some kind of dysfunctional system. So I think it's important for us just to name that these things exist and they're normal, and we just need to talk through them. And climate change is really hard because we're human, right? So we don't want to see things that are wrong. We can look at the same thing happening in our programs and explain it away, or see different things that are going on depending on who we are. And in cases like discrimination or sexual harassment, it's really easy to look at things on an individual level versus a systemic level, right? I mean, how many of us heard, well, John's just that way, or I think you misunderstood what I said. And so, I mean, those are common things that I've heard in my conversations. And as I thought about today and what I wanted to do for the keynote, I came across talking about faculty climate for a couple of reasons. But one is, I'm a full professor at this point. I have tenure. I have that protection. No one can take it away from me. I guess they could if I did something terrible, but I am protected. But I also have that responsibility as a tenured faculty member to name these things. And so if you're sitting in a place post-tenure, I hope that you really think about these things and name these things in your institutions too. I also focused on faculty climate because I think in counselor ed programs and the students we serve will succeed to the extent that we as counselor educators are able to thrive in our work and have the best environments possible. Another piece of it is we are preparing students. We are gatekeepers. We are role models. Students watch everything we do. I don't know how many times I've had doc students come to me and go, well, such and such they don't get along, or they watch everything we do. And so it's really important to model the kinds of behaviors that we want them to have. So let's look at some key climate issues, and we're going to look at 6 of them today. And as we go through these, you'll see that there's some quotes. Some of these are things I'll call out. that are from research that we've done in counselor education or that have appeared in the Chronicle of Higher Ed. Some of them are just conversations I've had with people about these issues. And so I will kind of present those as we go. So the first climate issue I like to refer to as academic sleepwalking. So for those of you who have been in counselor education for a while, okay, and if you haven't gotten there yet, then just you're proactively learning that these are the things you're going to be dealing with. So I want you to look at your programs and think about, have there been substantial changes in your program, in curriculum, the faculty makeup, the student makeup, the innovative programs and approaches, the way that you teach in the last 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years? Have there really been changes, or are you just sort of cycling through what you always do? So for those of you who might be experiencing some stagnation in your programs, there are probably some academic sleepwalkers among you, probably even you. These are folks that, intentionally or not, are just going through the motions of being a counselor educator. They're asleep, right? It's easy. It's very easy to get in a set. I've been guilty, and I know a lot of people have been guilty of using the same slides when we do student orientation year after year. We have the same field placement sites that we always have, you know, or our meetings look the same in our programs. I mean, we just are in a place of stagnation. You know, this idea of a rut of efficiency. We've got things down to a system, so don't mess with it, right? And so the thing about academic sleepwalking, it's really hard to be able to detect because we are, just like other areas of society, very structured in our careers. There's a message about how to be a successful counselor educator, right? You work hard, you separate your work life from your home life, opportunities will present themselves as long as you're always available. Your work is central to your life. And similar to other parts of society, counselor education is structured by race, by gender, and by class. And so we internalize these structures of what it means to be successful and what we need to do to be successful. We play the game just to survive, just to get ahead a little bit, and we know the rules aren't always fair to everyone. And so as I talk through these issues, I want you to understand that these issues that I mentioned today can affect anyone in counselor education, but they disproportionately affect women and faculty of color. And because of the nature of time, I can't get into all the other intersections that are even further marginalized. So these games that we play are particularly difficult for women and faculty of color. We need to be aware of what they are. So part of this game is fitting into professional standards, right? Look more like a professor, less like a student. Wait your turn to speak. Wear your hair a certain way, dress a particular way, speak a particular way, and in a certain order. And talk about these things versus not these things if you want promotion and tenure. I can think of many examples of being told, you look like a student. You don't look like a real department chair. You look tired, you don't have makeup on. Look at those high heels you're wearing. I've been told it's not a good idea to bring something up when I was upset with my full professors, and to be really nice to tenured faculty if I want tenure. I know a lot of people hear that. Power is inherent in the interactions of institutions. Hierarchies are established and reinforced through hiring, firings, handshakes, outfits. And this is particularly true in counselor education. Do I wear my hair straight or do I let it be curly? Does anyone else do this? I was trying to think, what's not gonna make me stereotype? Do I look more like I could be racially ambiguous? So academia is shaped by gender and race. We can't escape that. So let's talk about gender as just an example. We all dread the teaching evaluations, those course evaluations. There's nothing good about them, right? But we also know that research, especially for women and women of color, research shows that we get lower evaluations. The American Political Science Association did a study in 2018, And they found that the language students use in evaluations regarding male professors is significantly more positive than language used in evaluating female professors. A male instructor administering an identical online course as a female instructor receives higher ordinal teaching evaluations, even when the questions are not instructor specific. So this happens. Women just have to be better, right? And so when women get lower scores, they have to focus more energy into teaching at the cost of publishing, and or they leave the profession because of being discouraged by being in the field. So it limits advancement in two different ways. Now I'm going to talk to all my white folks in the room. I am white. It's very important how race is structured in counselor education. We need to talk about it. We think a lot about the myth of meritocracy in our society, that if you only work hard, you'll be able to get a full professor and tenure. You'll be treated as equal with authority, but there are other more subtle forms of things that we as white sleepwalkers do. For example, there's things such as the white silence or white bystander. This idea that things are too risky when we have racially tense situations, that it's too risky to talk about these issues. Or color blindness, where we pretend because we're counselor educators and we're all social justice advocates that race isn't relevant in our peers' lives. That we say things like, you know, I don't see color when I assign the courses I do to you, or I don't make judgments about your performance based on race. So, or we see a faculty of color as successful and we think, well, racism doesn't exist in my faculty. Or white logic. Things like, why don't my colleagues of color just make different choices? Why don't they participate more? Why don't they do research that's more mainstream and less multicultural? Why can't they just be normal, right? And then there's a term that's been floating around more recently that I became familiar with, this idea of white fragility, right? That anytime someone's successful as a person of color, that this is some kind of threat to the norms that we have in academia. It's quite interesting. We white folks have a long way to go, and we need to just start to realize these things. So it's hard to see academic sleepwalking because oftentimes it's ingrained in what we think of as normal counselor education faculty behaviors. Sometimes it's intentional stagnation because we're afraid to change, or we're denying that pressure is existing. But sometimes it's intentionally thinking that the program is doing well, our students are graduating, faculty seem happy. But as I mentioned, if you're post-tenure, you need to stir things up and think about how you're not making the changes that you need to make. So there are climate systems, there are programs that don't change or don't grow. And I want you to think about, I'll put a picture up here of a diner. I want you to think of that stagnant place of work as similar to a diner that's been in your town forever. There's that guy in the corner on Friday mornings with his coffee, reading his paper. There's the same music on the jukebox, the same wait staff, the same everything, right? And so how comfortable or how stifling that diner feels to you will largely depend on whether you see yourself there, whether you feel like you fit in, right? So this is the second climate issue I want to talk about, the issue of citizenship and representation. It's a lot like being at that diner and feeling like there's nothing on the menu for you, that the music doesn't relate to you, that you can't build rapport with the wait staff or the fellow customers. And so you may be in a position where you don't have a sense of comfort in that diner, but you're expected to act as if you do, right? So apply this to being a counselor education faculty member. You don't feel like you quite fit in. You may not be treated fairly, but you're supposed to support that program. So you may work at a place like that diner, and I want you to think about that. Is there a good old boys club at your program? Are there certain social events that are open to certain people or more convenient for certain people? Are you asking all your colleagues about their opinions about things that need to change in the program? Is everyone comfortable in the space? Are you asking? It's imperative for us to figure out who feels included and excluded in an authentic way in our faculty, because voice matters. Being represented, it relates to feeling like a citizen. We need to feel a part of something. So let's look at how representation and citizenship disproportionately affect women, particularly in areas of salary and advancement. The Chronicle of Higher Education puts out these nice interactive charts that I definitely encourage you to look at in terms of how men and women compare by salary based on rank. And you can see that across ranks, the disparities get bigger between men and women. And these are across all institutions. When we look at research institutions, the disparities are even worse. Some of these salary disparities are there from the beginning as a faculty member, and others happen as we get promoted and as merit raises, if you're lucky to get those, come into play. For example, female associate professors take longer by more than a year to be promoted to full professor. Then there's this piece about the pink-collar workforce, which is the disproportionate number of women that serve in adjunct faculty positions. The Chronicle of Higher Education says that the average salary in colleges of education for adjunct faculty is $3,100 per course. So if you're an adjunct faculty, not receiving benefits, maybe you're receiving a few, you're teaching a 4-4 load, you're trying to get a job and do the other things, you're making maybe $25,000 a year with very few benefits. We need to talk about this pink-collar workforce, this lack of ability to advance. And only about 18 to 22% of our faculty are faculty of color. And KCREP in their 2016 or 17 survey reported that we're at about 25% faculty of color. So we're a little higher than sort of the national average, but not high enough. When we look across the ranks and start to look at race and ethnicity and how this plays into gender as well, we see that the issues are even more pervasive for faculty of color as we move across. These are some of the percentages as we look at different groups of faculty by race and gender and ethnicity. So it would be one thing if faculty members were entering careers with specific economic disparities. But the truth is, women and faculty of color often enter these positions without the cushion of financial support. They may have substantial student debt. They have caregiving responsibilities of children and extended families. They may not have models of higher education because they're first-generation students, so they lack this support in addition to not having this salary, this financial equity piece. And in addition to all of that, there are real experiences of discrimination that faculty of color face that don't go away just because they can come in their office and shut the door. From these statistics on salary and advancement, we begin to see how the structure of education and higher education and counselor education are reinforced. And because men and whites, as you can see by these percentages, are disproportionately at the higher end, they're the full professors, there's a certain status and automatic advantage that they receive because they're most visibly in those ranks. People assume that they have this authority, right? That their recommendations are accepted, their directions should be followed. I mean, how many times have you been in a meeting and the full professors are the ones that are just believed or their directions are taken? And some of this is based on what we're seeing in terms of this disproportionate rank. And a flip side of all of these advantages for white faculty and males in particular is that faculty of color face particular issues of misrepresentation. Rhonda Bryant and her colleagues talk about how African-American counselor educators are responded to as caricatures. We're all familiar with Mammy from Gone with the Wind, this caricature that Black women in counselor education are supposed to be this organizational spouse. They take care of the white male faculty and to some extent the white female faculty. They can handle many things. They never tire. They never need anything. Or there's this other caricature of Sapphire from Amos and Andy, this loud, animated, angry Black woman, right? And so there's this dichotomy of misrepresentation that they face from this research. It's been shown. And that what they try to do is mitigate these experiences. And it's, I can't curse because we're being part. It's exhausting, right? It's exhausting. And research shows that they disproportionately are impacted in terms of depression and anxiety, and they're code switching and all these things. Thinking about all those issues that we talked about how to wear their hair and how to perform and how to speak, etc. And this just isn't African American women, it's African American men and other faculty of color. But the research is so new in terms of looking at these different experiences. When there lacks representation and citizenship among a faculty of sleepwalkers, faculty of traditional marginalized populations can feel illegitimate, invisible, and sometimes hyper-visible. The more that we delegitimize faculty voice and representation, the less that they're acknowledged for their intellectual value and contribution. By us, by students, we see it all the time. And so there are two issues of visibility I want to speak to you about today. But I'd like to read these quickly. I notice on CESNet a lot of people talk, but the people that seem to talk the most tend to be males. I think being a minority makes me have to be better and try harder. There are a lot of people in our profession that have voiced commitment to multiculturalism that have not mentored me, even though I have gone to them. When it came to walking the talk, it wasn't there. So let's look about on the invisibility side of the coin in terms of minoritized population. These are just some of the ways that we see invisibility manifest. Faculty being mistaken as a student, being called by the wrong name. The true story, we have 80 faculty, and I don't have anybody from my university, and so we have 80 faculty, we have 4 African American faculty, and folks mix up their names all the time. I'm like, it's not that hard. It's not that hard. So, I mean, I see this all the time. People being ignored in meetings, scholarship not being valued because it deals with diversity issues, using dominant text in terms of from white males. We see the same sort of texts that circulate in counselor education. Having your credentials questioned, not having your students' trust, right? Because if you're not making your faculty feel visible, the students are watching you, right? They're going to treat them not as legitimate as you are. Having identities erased when we don't look at intersectionality. Research shows that there's inadequate mentorship and professional development opportunities for marginalized faculty. And then there's just passive-aggressive actions that we see from full professors for non-tenure track faculty in terms of just forgetting tasks or not sharing information that needs to be shared or showing up late, those kinds of things that seem to happen. So the other side of this is hypervisibility, and this is the unwritten workload. So Franklin and Boyd Franklin talked about this term, invisibility syndrome, about 20 years ago, about this notion that white individuals often dismiss or ignore or pretend not to see faculty or individuals of color, unless they need to see them, right? And so this is the hypervisibility piece that we have to deal with, and this is that unwritten workload. You may not fit in the faculty culture, but we expect you to engage in service, right? Nicole Hill and her colleagues talked about teaching and service in counselor education as very feminine-oriented pieces of our jobs. There are also pieces of our jobs that aren't rewarded in terms of promotion and tenure. So there are faculty members, particularly women and faculty of color, that tend to do a lot of department service, institutional housekeeping, advising, while others don't, and we don't talk about it. And at the moment of entering academia, women and faculty of color also are tasked with something special. They get to advise and mentor students that look like them. So they have this additional, and many welcome it, but it's also a burden in terms of the other things that we're expected to do. Many counselor education programs, I haven't met one yet, burden non-tenure track or non-tenured faculty with service obligations. And Melissa Harris-Perry, who's professor at Wake Forest, compares service duties of faculty members to yard work, right? When you're a tenured faculty member and you're having to do service, it's like doing yard work on a house that you're on the title. It feels okay, right? It's your house. You got to get out there and do the gardening. But if you're a non-tenure track person, it feels like you're just doing yard work for someone else and someone else's benefit. And we need to be really aware of that when we ask faculty without power, without tenure to take on service, that it feels like doing something that benefits someone else that they may not feel quite a part of. We're the ones tapped to be on every committee that has to do with anything black, brown, yellow, etc. We're the ones working extra hours at predominantly white institutions because we have students that only feel safe coming to us with their issues or concerns because we understand. They trot me every chance they get because I'm the only person of color on the faculty. Okay. So my role right now is Executive Associate Dean, and basically I do a lot of paperwork in the college. I handle the internal operations of the college, and it's fun for the most part. I've had a lot of faculty come to me, and one in particular that I remember this quote, and she said, "I just really admire everything you do, but I just want to be a mommy first." And I said, "Oh, okay." It's like, well, I want to be a mommy first too, and I want to show my kids that you can have a successful career. But I didn't say that. But it just struck me that there's this dichotomy, and so there's this climate issue that disproportionately affects women, and I refer to it as the second shift here. And so here's some quotes from the research that I think are useful from a qualitative study from Trupal and Stinchfield. Do you think she knew she was pregnant when she applied for the position? I actually heard that on the search committee. I don't know why you need to take 6 weeks off after you've had your baby. Didn't women used to have babies and be out in the fields the next day? This was a colleague told me this, that her department chair told her that. Some of those smaller perks may not be made available to you because the mindset is that you're not going to be a team player anyway, because you're going to be diverted by other things going on in your life with your child. So the second shift refers to those caregiving responsibilities of a faculty member that disproportionately fall to women. And it's not a bad thing, it's just we need to be aware of it so we don't set women up to fail in counselor education, given the structure of higher education and what success is in counselor education. And in this space, we cannot ignore also there's 43 million people in the US that also are caregivers for those that are chronically ill, or those that have disabilities, or that have aging parents, etc. And those also tend to be women that are raising children themselves. So there's a double duty here for a lot of women, particularly in our field. And it's not that men don't have children. I love my partner. I think he's a great contributor to our child rearing, but it's just a different experience in terms of career progression, particularly when we're talking about tenure track positions and when we form families. I remember as a doc student having conversations with my friends. These sound really crazy now, but some of you might be having these conversations, so you'd sound crazy. We talked about having kids at 3 times in our lives, right? You can have a kid in your dissertation phase, right? While you're writing your dissertation, because that's easy. Or you can have a kid at mid-tenure, after you go through your 3rd year, you turn it, right? It's like very regimented. Or you need to wait till after your tenure, right? These are the 3 times, and we're like so pressured by this. And I remember even advising some of my doc students or having conversations about when are you gonna have kids? And I'm just like, this sounds so stupid now to do that. But I never did that with my male students. Never did that. But it was always about how are you going to handle everything, right? And that's what this literature and everything talks about in terms of this client issue. We automatically assume that A, people can't handle it, or we don't help accommodate this process that's a natural part of being the process in terms of whether you're adopting or having children of your own. So after the birth of my 2 kids, I have a 4- and a 6-year-old, I've never heard anyone ask my partner, who's also a counselor educator, how are you handling everything? But I've had people tell me, you need to slow down, they're only young once, right? So we just need to be careful about some of these things that we say, for sure. Let's look at some of the costs of this second shift. And when I say costs, I'm not talking about like these are terrible things. They're just reality, the things that we need to think about in terms of the costs. There's an obvious one, right? Well, first, the tenure clock and the biological clock if you're a normal traditional student, right, and doc program, tend to be on the same cycle. So there's also some balance issues there. But there's an obvious cost of just diversion of time from work. You've got family responsibilities, so you can't publish and you can't do the things that you need to do to advance. There's also the stigma of university policies. So at my previous institution, they instituted a policy where your children couldn't be on campus, which I don't even understand. Remember, right? Why, for one? But so can you imagine, like, having caregiving responsibilities, but also having to be at work late or having to pick your kids up, and your kids couldn't come back to campus? Or were there universities where there aren't any kind of after-school care, right? And as folks that teach in graduate programs, we teach at night. So it already disadvantages our careers in many ways. There are also policies where there's either unpaid or insufficient family leave. There's inflexible work schedules, particularly those that are in administrative positions. And then there's this false permission to stop the tenure clock. And research shows that stopping the tenure clock benefits men and it hurts women. There's research out there that talks about that. So it isn't safe to stop the tenure clock, even if you're allowed to do so. So it's important in counselor ed programs for us to devise some of the ways that we can create some flexibility and accommodations for caregivers. And then when we look at additional stigma and marginalization for those that adopt and LGBTQI couples and families, and how they navigate those pieces of being a family, etc. And as I've alluded to, there's others' perspectives of what you can handle as someone who's pregnant or who is a mother. So Trefall and Stinchfield coined the term maternal wall, this idea of talking about children, having children, being pregnant, being near a child as a woman. You're already sort of assumed that you're not going to be able to advance in your career. And there's other research in higher education that talks about that once you have a child, you're perceived as not viable for research projects. And I can remember this as a doc student, looking at my peers who got pregnant during that first period that we're allowed to get pregnant, and thinking, oh my gosh, how are they going to have a career now they've got a family? And it's just kind of crazy stuff that we've sort of internalized, those structures that we've internalized. Are they going to be able to finish their doctorate if they've got a kid? Those kinds of things. There is also the perspective of what it means in terms of advancement. I've talked about this, how stopping the clock is viewed. Or there was also recently in New York Times an article last month that talked about women who have had children are less likely to receive promotions or raises. And I think that would apply certainly to any career. So whether there are things that women fail to do because of the demands of caregiving or whether they're perceived to not handle, there's certainly real cost to advancement. Mary Ann Mason at Cal Berkeley did some research, she's a sociologist, and she found that mothers of young children are 21% less likely to be hired as tenure track as compared to those that do not have children. And only 58% of early career mothers, those that have babies early in their academic career, receive tenure, compared to 78% of fathers that do. Okay, it's not all doom and gloom, we have to do this. So I would be remiss in this year not to talk about sexual harassment. I don't know about you all, but I am really angry this week. So I'm gonna try to not rant in this keynote about sexual harassment. But I do want to share a story. So I started my position and I was really excited as a new assistant professor to receive a faculty position and excited to join the faculty. And I had an experience with a full professor on my faculty. And he said to me, he's like, he winked at me and he said, I had a dream about you last night. And I also, and there's a quote up here, someone's told me, you're much prettier than your old boss. I don't even know what that means. But I remember when that wink happened and that was said to me, I remember how it affected me because I thought I was hired for my knowledge, my contribution, right? And now you're dreaming about me and you're making these innuendos, and this is a full professor, right? So for several years until I got tenure, it was about navigating this kind of dynamic that was going on, and it just wasn't one person. And so that really stuck with me and really impacted. And what's funny, and the person, my chair at the time I went up for tenure, didn't know all of this that had happened. But one of the things he said was, you need to go around all the full professors and make sure you're nice to them. You talk to them, right? So you get tenure, you don't have any problems. Now, I had 44 publications, but I needed to go be nice to people, right? So it really pisses me off now. I should have just not taken that advice. But, so, I mean, this is a real thing. And as you can see from these quotes up here, it happens all the time. These are some other things that have been, colleagues have shared with me. I was seeking career advice one day from a male colleague in my department. I was married with 2 kids. He asked me if I thought people were naturally monogamous. During office moves later, I was assigned to a window office next to him. I told my chair I could not be next to him and why. My chair reported the harassment to HR, nothing happened, and I still had to move next door to him. He asked me out on a date several times. He would come in my office to say hello, hugging me too long. I was an assistant professor, what could I do? And so these things happen. And we need to really think of sexual harassment as gender harassment, right? It's justifying certain expressions of masculinity to exploit women. That's what it is. And what its function is in the workplace is it perpetuates gender inequity. It leads to some of the other issues that we talk about in terms of salary and advancement. You need to be a certain way as a woman, no matter if we're in 2018 or not, for you to get ahead. So, and the thing is, universities are very privileged places because of all the issues I've talked about and how we structure rank and how the authority we give to certain people in certain positions. We put people on a pedestal. One scholar in the Chronicle wrote this quote from last year, and I thought it was really poignant. We build this culture by worshiping academics as gods, inflating their sense of importance, clandestinely defending their work against all rebuke, closing doors to critical outsiders, and excusing their troubling behavior as the expression of tortured genius. And I think we do this when people behave badly in terms of sexual harassment and gender harassment. And so we need a better proactive plan, because what I've experienced when people are either too afraid to come forward, like in my case, I was too afraid, or if they do go forward, it gets reported to HR and they don't do anything, or they say, okay, all the faculty needs to go through a sexual harassment training. We need to proactively, as counselor ed programs, talk about this and what we're gonna do and what we're not gonna accept. Because you don't wanna get it to a place where the university is having to handle it. You certainly wanna involve them, but you wanna make sure that you identify how people are gonna behave properly. So I want you to consider how gender harassment might be occurring among your faculty, what behaviors are getting excused, what role you play in maintaining that environment. With the resurgence of the Me Too movement, and it is a resurgence, it did exist before, as we all know, there's a lot of good things that have come out of it in terms of survivors feel that they can come out, that they can share a story. People are more comfortable in sharing their stories, particularly those that happen in the workplace. Men are starting to understand in some cases where maybe they didn't understand that things might be harassment that wasn't identified as such before. So there's some really good things. There's also some things you may have noticed coming out of the U.S. Department of Education around the sexual misconduct rules that they're changing or proposing to change, and these are expected to take place. They're proposing to change the way that we define sexual harassment, that it has to come to a point where it's so severe that it impacts your life. So the bar was lower before in terms of reporting. They're also proposing that you can only have a sexual harassment case on campus if it's on campus. So if it's an off-campus work event, it doesn't count. It doesn't get to be reported. There are also additional due process rights for the accused. That's not a bad thing. So those are in place. But the one thing that's even more concerning is that schools, if these rules are applied, get to establish their own evidentiary standards for what is sexual harassment or not. And whatever standards they choose has to apply to all other civil rights violations. So this just isn't about women, right? So these are scary times in terms of where we're going with sexual harassment, even in the Me Too movement. The last climate issue I want to talk about is recruitment and retention. And we are just really bad at recruiting and retaining counselor programs for the most part. And a lot of our ability to retain colleagues are based on some of the 5 issues that I've already talked to you about. So it is an ethical imperative that we do this appropriately. And I want to share these quotes up here, and for the sake of time, I'm gonna move on. I think of recruitment with a baseball analogy, right? So you've got a team of brand new counselor education faculty members, right? And they all need to cross the home plate. They all need to score. They all need to be successful. They all want to be a part of that team. But because of disparities in the way that we're mentored as doc students, because of some of the demographics that we come into positions, some of the issues we've talked about already, because of mentorship opportunities that have been available, people are at different places. Some people are at the batter's box. They're ready to hit the ball. Some are at first base. Some are at third base. And some are still in the dugout. And as a counselor education faculty, we have to figure out how to equitably help every single new faculty member across the home plate. And so just want you to think about that as a recruitment and a retention issue, that we want to bring in people of different talents, but we also have to make sure they have what they need to be successful. So, as I mentioned, we're terrible at this, right? We tend to be, I know you've been on search committees before, many of you. We naturally gravitate towards hiring people that look like us or think like us, and even though we have protections in terms of affirmative action for gender and race ethnicity that's supposed to protect against hiring biases, we're still very biased in the way that we perform search committees. And I wanted to share with you a couple of things that have actually been said on search committees that I have been on. And I already mentioned, did she know she was pregnant? People were really angry at this one woman because she was pregnant when she interviewed, like, oh my God. And I'm in the room, I'm like, hello, I'm a woman, but it didn't matter. So the candidate of color was very articulate. I've heard people say that, because that's surprising. We just can't get any faculty of color to apply. Their focus on diversity research isn't specific enough. They just don't seem like a good fit here, and I'm concerned that he won't want to come here. This is for an African-American male faculty member. We already have someone who does diversity research here. That was another thing that has been said. One of the things about my position is I get to talk to people as they exit our university, and it happens everywhere, people leave. And the things that they'll say publicly to people is like, you know, it just wasn't a good fit, or my family was moving, etc. But the things that they tell me, particularly women and particularly faculty of color, are these things. Obviously, sometimes there's insufficient salary or other kinds of perks. I mean, we can't get away from that. But for the most part, people will stay if they feel like they belong. I mean, there's research to support this, and what people tell me supports this anecdotally. They're not doing what they enjoy doing. They're not feeling valued for their contributions. They're not feeling part of something meaningful. They don't have a support system, including a lack of engagement outside of work. Remember the diner and talking about the good old boy club and happy hours and all of that? They don't feel like they're ever invited, right? So it's really simple to keep faculty. You just have to make them feel like they belong. You just have to give them a community to belong to. It's really that simple. So as you look at your recent hires or people that you hire, think about and discuss the reasons they may have left previous positions. Ask about it so you can prevent it. It is that easy. So as we're winding down, there are 6 issues that I've presented today: academic sleepwalking, citizenship and representation, legitimacy and visibility, the second shift, sexual harassment, and recruitment and retention. And a lot of these are independent, you can get the sense of that. But if we start to think about these issues and evaluate their presence in our programs, we can really begin to build a good, positive climate. So here's the good news. Climates can change. They do change. Climate change is real, right? Believe me, it's real. And the first thing we have to do is get away from this narrative, oh, to make things better, you've got to lose something, right? We need to talk to faculty about what they can gain from changing the climate. We've got to talk about this notion of specifically what they can gain. So you don't say, well, diversity is good, it's good for students. Tell them why. Tell them it actually helps their cognitive complexity. It makes them smarter people, right? You got to talk to other people that don't look like you. It's good for you, right? Give them a reason to see it's a benefit. We've got to start there, because people will not give up power until they see that they're gaining power in a different way. And so we need to be able to do that. These are some of the major components that we need to strive for in terms of a healthy faculty environment. And I'll briefly go through these. On the next slide, I give you a YouTube link that has the 75 strategies that I told you I would not read to you to help you get to these. And then on the slide following that, I have a Google link where you can get this entire presentation. So in case you don't write everything down or you want a copy of it, you can have a copy of it. But just very quickly, we know salary is important for climate, but we also know relationship building is the biggest predictor for satisfaction pre-tenure faculty. We have that. We value relationships in our programs and departments more than we do compensation. And so this idea of creating a place of interdependence where people feel connected, they feel included, they feel valued, they're appreciated, they belong to not just the program, but the university and the community. They trust each other, they respect each other. And then there's equity. Obviously, equity and fairness in terms of workload, right? Reducing the service burden, some of the issues that I talked about, but having safety and speaking up, having space where people can exchange ideas about knowledge and counselor education, that we don't just have to think of it in a traditional sense that we've been doing for 50 decades, but how can we think differently about preparing counselor educators? How can we stop sleepwalking, right? That there's space to resolve conflicts, that issues can be addressed, that each faculty member feels safe and comfortable to go talk directly to another faculty member. So I've been in places where a faculty member had to go through a department chair to complain about another faculty member, and like there's this weird like telephone thing. And so you want to create a system where people can talk directly to each other, that there's equity in that. Role clarity. Everyone knows what they're supposed to do, but everyone is mutually responsible for getting the larger task done. There's cross-training, this idea that we're all in it together, right? And so not this, oh, well, she's the program coordinator, so I don't need to know anything about the curriculum. I've heard that, right? But this idea that we do share responsibility, but yet we're clear on what everyone does, and we respect that. And then there's the plan for success, that desire for all the faculty to be there and to show up, this belief that there's a clear purpose, there's a goal, there's outcomes that people are working towards, and all of this framed within a faculty that values cultural competence, that you openly talk about diversity, not only on the faculty, but diversity issues in general in counselor education. So this is a YouTube video. It's about 15 minutes long, but it has 75 strategies that talk about how we can begin to address some of the 6 climate issues that I presented. So I invite you to take a look at that. And then I will just shift to the next slide, which has the Google link on it, where you can get all of this. It also has the YouTube link. So it's JOH1AX, where it's available. At the end of the presentation, there are references and web resources, or you can see that I didn't make all this up. And I just want to thank you for your attention and joining me in this space, and let's go change some climate. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your groundbreaking and very important presentation.